The massive alien ships appeared in New Haven's sky like dark storm clouds, blocking out the morning sun. Their hulls were smooth and silver, bigger than anything the human colonists had ever seen. Admiral Catherine Walsh pressed her face against the command center window, watching as more ships kept arriving, forming a perfect circle around their world. "Ma'am, they've cut us off completely," said Lieutenant James Fletcher, his young face pale as he stared at his computer screen. "No ships can get in or out. No messages either. We're trapped." Catherine had been a soldier for over 20 years, but she had never seen anything like this. The Valdorians were famous across the galaxy for one thing: they never lost a battle. Every planet they attacked surrendered within days. Their ships were faster, their weapons stronger, and their tactics perfect. Most species gave up before the fighting even started. "How much food do we have?" Catherine asked Captain Rebecca Stone, who was in charge of supplies. Rebecca checked her notes with shaking hands. "If we're very careful with what we eat, maybe 3 weeks. For weeks if we're lucky, and eat almost nothing." The alien voice came through their radio system, speaking in perfect English through their translation machines. The words were cold and emotionless. "Humans of New Haven Colony. You have 2 days to give up. Your bodies need food every day. We will not let any food reach you. Choose to be smart instead of foolish." Catherine looked around at her officers. They were scared, but they were also angry. These aliens thought humans were weak, that hunger would make them surrender like frightened children. They were about to learn how wrong they were. She turned on the colony's main communication system so everyone could hear her. Her voice reached every farm, every mining station, every school, and every home on New Haven. "People of New Haven, this is Admiral Walsh. The Valdorians think we'll give up in a few days because we'll get hungry. They think we're like all the other species they've defeated. But they don't know humans very well." Through the speakers, she could hear voices from all over the colony responding with determination. Men and women who had left Earth to build new lives weren't about to surrender them without a fight. "We've survived worse things before," Catherine continued. "Our great-grandparents lived through terrible winters, droughts that lasted years, and wars that went on for decades. We have that same strength inside us. Save your food, help your neighbors, and remember that we're not just fighting for our homes. We're showing the entire galaxy what humans can do when we refuse to give up." In the mines deep underground, workers like Thomas Harrison and his team listened to the Admiral's words. Thomas was a doctor who had come to New Haven to help the colonists stay healthy. Now he would have to help them survive starvation. "Doc, how long can people really go without food?" asked Emily Carter, one of the nurses who worked with him. Thomas thought carefully before answering. "The human body is amazing, Emily. Our ancestors didn't always have enough to eat. Sometimes they went weeks between good meals. We can survive much longer than these aliens think we can." Above ground, families were already working together. Parents explained to their children why they would have to eat less. Neighbors shared what little they had. Store owners gave away their food supplies instead of keeping them for themselves. The colony was becoming one big family, all working toward the same goal: survival. Sergeant William Brooks gathered his soldiers at the outer defense posts. These men and women were thin from months of hard work building the colony, but their eyes were bright with purpose. "The enemy thinks hunger will make us weak," he told them. "But I've been hungry before, and it just made me angry. Angry soldiers fight harder than comfortable ones." On the alien command ship high above, Subcommander Thexrill studied the human settlement through powerful cameras. Everything looked normal. People were still moving around, still working, still preparing defenses. This confused him. According to all their research, humans needed regular meals or they became too weak to fight. "Are you sure our information about humans is correct?" he asked his science officer. "Yes, sir. Human bodies require nutrition every 24 to 72 hours, or they suffer severe weakness. No species has ever maintained military readiness during our siege tactics." But Thexrill felt uneasy. Something about these humans seemed different. They weren't panicking or sending desperate messages begging for mercy. They were preparing for a long fight. As the first day of the siege ended, the twin sons of New Haven sat behind the alien blockade. In homes across the colony, families ate smaller dinners than usual and talked quietly about the days ahead. Children asked questions their parents couldn't fully answer, but everyone understood that they were part of something important. The Valdorians settled their ships into position, confident that hunger would do their work for them. They had conquered dozens of worlds this way. Cut off the food supply, wait a few days, and accept the surrender. It was simple and effective. But as the alien commanders prepared for what they expected would be a very short siege, they had no idea they were about to face something they had never encountered before: humans who would rather starve than surrender. The galaxy was about to learn that some species don't break when pushed to their limits. Instead, they become more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The siege of New Haven had begun, and neither side truly understood what they were about to experience. 3 weeks had passed since the Valdorian ships first surrounded New Haven, and Subcommander Thexril stared at his computer screens with growing confusion. The numbers made no sense at all. According to everything he knew about human biology, the colonists should be too weak to walk by now, let alone continue their organized defense. Check the sensors again, he ordered his science officer for the 5th time that morning. Sir, I've run diagnostics 12 times. All equipment is working perfectly. The humans are still maintaining regular patrols, still working in their fields, still preparing defensive positions. Their life signs show stress and weight loss, but nothing like what our models predicted. Down on New Haven's surface, the effects of rationing were clearly visible on every face. Admiral Catherine Walsh had lost 20 pounds, her uniform hanging loose on her smaller frame. But her mind remained sharp, and her daily meetings with the colony leadership continued without fail. Daily report, she requested from Captain Rebecca Stone, whose own cheeks had become hollow but whose record-keeping remained perfect. Food supplies holding at 1/3 normal portions, Rebecca reported, reading from her careful notes. Medical team reports weight loss across the entire population, but Dr. Harrison says we're doing better than expected. No critical health emergencies yet. In the medical center, Dr. Thomas Harrison moved between patients who looked thin and tired but remained surprisingly strong. Old miners who had worked hard their whole lives continued reporting for duty despite ribs showing through their work shirts. Young mothers continued caring for their children while eating barely enough to keep themselves alive. The human body is truly remarkable, Dr. Harrison explained to Nurse Emily Carter as they checked on a group of farmers. We evolved during ice ages when food was scarce. Our ancestors survived by storing energy when food was available and using it slowly when times were hard. These aliens studied our biology, but they missed something important about our history. Emily watched as a farmer named David, whose belt now had 3 new holes, continued planning the next week's harvest schedule. How are they staying so focused when they're this hungry? Because hunger is just discomfort, Thomas replied. Humans have endured much worse and kept going. These people aren't just surviving starvation. They're proving that willpower can overcome physical limitations. Lieutenant James Fletcher coordinated the defense teams from his post near the colony's edge. His soldiers, now lean and sharp-eyed like hunting wolves, maintained their watch positions with quiet determination. Their movements had become more careful, more efficient, but no less effective. The enemy keeps waiting for us to collapse, Fletcher told Sergeant William Brooks during their evening briefing. They don't understand that being hungry doesn't mean being helpless. My grandfather fought in wars where soldiers went days without proper meals. They didn't surrender. They got angrier. Throughout the colony, something beautiful was happening that the Valdorians couldn't see or understand. Neighbors shared their small portions with families who had children. Teachers continued classes for the young ones, making lessons about history and science that helped everyone understand they were part of something bigger than themselves. Workers in different areas took turns so everyone could rest and preserve their strength. Margaret Collins, who ran the colony's small library, organized evening storytelling sessions where people shared tales of human endurance throughout history. She told stories of Arctic explorers, desert travelers, and people who survived disasters that should have been impossible. These stories reminded everyone that they carried the genes of survivors. Our great-great-grandparents crossed oceans in tiny ships, she said one evening to a group of children and adults gathered in the library. They walked across frozen continents and sailed through terrible storms. We have that same strength inside us. On the Valdorian command ship, frustration was growing like a disease. Officers whispered in corridors, questioning the intelligence reports that had promised a quick victory. Some began accessing human historical records, trying to understand what they were really facing. Sir, reported the communications officer to Subcommander Thexril, we're detecting increased message traffic between the human settlements. They're not discussing surrender terms. They're sharing recipes for making small amounts of food last longer. Thexril studied the intercepted communications with disbelief. Instead of panic and desperation, he found messages about community gardens, efficient cooking methods, and people volunteering to work extra shifts so others could rest. These humans were treating the siege like a difficult season to survive together, not a military defeat to accept. Perhaps their food reserves were larger than our intelligence suggested, offered his second-in-command. No, Thexril replied, shaking his head. Our scans were thorough. They should have exhausted their supplies 2 weeks ago. Yet they continue functioning as an organized society. How is this possible? The answer lay in something the Valdorians had never encountered before. A species that grew stronger through shared hardship instead of weaker. Every day the siege continued, the bonds between the colonists became stronger. Parents taught children about patience and endurance. Adults found new ways to help each other. The entire colony was becoming like one large family, united by their determination to prove that humans don't break easily. As night fell over New Haven, families gathered for their small evening meals. Children who were learning to be hungry without complaining. Adults who shared stories and made plans for the future they refused to let the aliens take away. And leaders who continued believing that tomorrow would come, and that humans would still be standing to see it. The Valdorians had expected desperation and surrender. Instead, they were witnessing something that would change how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. The news traveled through space faster than light itself, carried by communication networks that connected every corner of the galaxy. On hundreds of worlds, alien species who had surrendered quickly to Valdorian attacks now watched the siege of New Haven with growing amazement and something they had almost forgotten: hope. In the great halls of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Helen Wright appeared on the main viewing screen, her image transmitted directly from the besieged colony. Though she had lost weight like everyone on New Haven, her voice remained strong and clear as she addressed the assembled representatives from dozens of different worlds. Honored members of the Council, she began, New Haven continues to resist after 5 weeks of complete blockade. We do not ask for military help, but we ask you to witness what we are proving. Determination can defeat superior technology. Unity can overcome impossible odds. The Altarian representative, whose people had been humanity's first friends in space, shifted uncomfortably in his specialized chair. His blue skin seemed paler than usual as he spoke. Ambassador Wright, surely your people cannot continue this indefinitely. Perhaps negotiations with the Valdorians would be wise. Many reasonable terms could be discussed. Helen's thin face showed a small smile. Negotiations were offered to us 5 weeks ago, Ambassador. The terms were simple: surrender completely or starve. We chose a third option that the Valdorians did not expect. We chose to endure. Across the galaxy, the effect of her words rippled outward like waves in a pond. On Kepler 442b, the Andromedan people gathered in secret meetings for the first time since their conquest 3 years earlier. They had submitted to Valdorian rule after just 6 hours of fighting, believing resistance was hopeless. Now they whispered different questions to each other. If humans can survive 5 weeks of starvation and still fight back, what could we have done with our crystal caverns to hide in? Asked their former military leader, Zexandra, whose name had become forbidden to speak aloud under Valdorian rule. On Proxima Centauri, another human colony received its first diplomatic message from the Viridian Empire, whose representatives had previously ignored all human attempts at trade agreements. The message was brief but significant. We wish to discuss mutual defense arrangements and cultural exchange programs. Meanwhile, aboard the Valdorian flagship, doubt spread through the ranks like poison. Subcommander Thexril found himself spending hours reading human historical records, trying to understand what his forces were really facing. The files disturbed him deeply. He learned about something called the Siege of Leningrad, where humans had survived 872 days of starvation and bombing, eating leather and tree bark while still defending their city. He read about the Donner Party, who had crossed frozen mountains despite losing half their number to hunger and cold. He discovered accounts of humans surviving shipwrecks by floating on debris for weeks, of desert travelers walking for days without water, of prisoners who had endured years of torture without revealing military secrets. These records cannot be accurate, he told his science officer. No species could survive such conditions and continue functioning. Sir, I have verified the sources multiple times. Human history appears to be filled with examples of surviving impossible circumstances. Perhaps our initial assessment of their capabilities was incomplete. The doubt was spreading to the lower ranks as well. Valdorian soldiers who had expected to accept human surrender weeks ago now found themselves staring at an enemy that refused to behave according to their tactical manuals. Some had even begun studying human military history themselves, discovering warriors who had fought battles while wounded, outnumbered, and starving. Lieutenant Vextar, grandson of a famous Valdorian general, approached his commander with questions that would have been unthinkable a month earlier. Sir, if humans can maintain military effectiveness under these conditions, should we reconsider our siege tactics for future operations? Subcommander Thexril had been wondering the same thing. Every Valdorian military doctrine assumed that cutting off food supplies would create rapid surrender. But these humans were proving that assumption wrong in the most public way possible. The psychological impact extended far beyond military concerns. On dozens of conquered worlds, species that had accepted Valdorian rule without major resistance began asking themselves difficult questions. The crystalline collective had surrendered after their food production facilities were threatened. The methane breathers had capitulated when their atmospheric processors were targeted. Each had assumed that resistance would be futile and costly. But now they watched as humans endured what should have been impossible, maintaining not just survival but organized military resistance. The sight of Admiral Catherine Walsh giving daily briefings, thin but unbroken, became a symbol of defiance that spread across the galaxy faster than any government could control. On the water world of Aquatica, the dolphin-like cetaceans held their first resistance planning meeting in a generation. On the desert planet Solaris, the lizard people began quietly moving weapons and supplies to hidden locations. Even on peaceful worlds that had never experienced conquest, military leaders began developing new defensive strategies based on human endurance tactics. Back on New Haven, the colonists remained largely unaware of their growing galactic influence. They were focused on simple survival, sharing their meager rations and supporting each other through each difficult day. But their struggle had become something much larger than a single colony's fight for survival. It had become proof that surrender was a choice, not an inevitable outcome. The galaxy was learning that some species become more dangerous when pushed to their limits, not weaker. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, other species were beginning to remember what resistance meant. The siege had transformed from a local military action into a galactic symbol of hope, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. 7 weeks into the siege, the Valdorian soldiers had grown lazy and careless. Their daily patrols followed the same routes at the same times. Their guards ate regular meals and slept in comfortable beds aboard their ships, confident that the starving humans below posed no real threat. They were about to learn the most dangerous lesson in military history: never underestimate a cornered enemy. Admiral Catherine Walsh stood in the underground command center, her body now 40 pounds lighter than when the siege began. Her uniform hung on her like a tent, but her eyes burned with fierce intelligence. Around her, officers who looked like walking skeletons maintained their posts with the precision of professional soldiers. "Tonight, we remind our uninvited guests what happens when you corner a human," she announced to her senior staff. "They think starvation has made us helpless. Time to show them how wrong they are." Lieutenant James Fletcher had spent weeks preparing for this moment. His soldiers, now lean as starving wolves but twice as dangerous, had mapped every weakness in the alien perimeter. Their hunger had sharpened their focus rather than dulled it, turning them into perfect predators studying their prey. Alpha and Beta teams hit the supply depot at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Fletcher briefed his squad leaders in whispers. Charlie and Delta create noise and confusion on the eastern hills to draw their attention. "Remember, we may be hungry, but they've gotten comfortable and lazy." Captain Rebecca Stone had carefully saved their remaining explosives for this single, desperate attack. "We get one chance to hurt them badly and prove we're still dangerous. Make every shot count, make every bomb matter." The plan was simple but brilliant. The humans had been so quiet and seemingly helpless for weeks that the Valdorian sensors had stopped registering them as threats. Their biosignatures had dropped so low that the alien computers classified them as harmless wildlife rather than enemy soldiers. As the 2 moons set behind the mountains, the humans moved like ghosts across terrain they knew better than their own faces. Sergeant William Brooks led the demolition team through narrow canyons and cave systems that the aliens had dismissed as impassable. His men, hollow-cheeked and sharp-eyed, carried homemade explosives that would turn alien overconfidence into burning wreckage. Dr. Thomas Harrison had volunteered to join the medical support team, despite being needed at the hospital. "If our people get hurt out there, they'll need immediate help," he told Nurse Emily Carter. "Besides, I've lost 30 pounds too. I'm just as invisible to their sensors as everyone else." The attack began at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers across the main Valdorian supply depot as human commandos struck targets they had watched and studied for weeks. The alien guards, caught completely unprepared, stumbled around in panic, trying to respond to attacks that seemed to come from empty air. "Impossible." Subcommander Thexrill shouted as alarm sirens screamed throughout his command ship. "Our sensors show no significant life forms in those areas." His terrified science officer's hands shook as he checked his instruments again and again. "Sir, the human biosignatures have been so weak for so long that our computers classified them as small animals. They've been invisible to our security systems for weeks. On the ground, Fletcher's teams fought with a fury that shocked their enemies. These weren't the healthy, well-fed soldiers the Valdorians had expected to face eventually. These were humans pushed beyond their physical limits, fighting with the desperate strength that comes only when there's nothing left to lose. Every movement was precise because they couldn't waste energy. Every shot hit its target because they couldn't afford to miss. Margaret Collins, the librarian who had kept morale high with her stories, now proved that civilians could be just as dangerous as soldiers. She led a team of teachers and shopkeepers in destroying alien communication equipment, moving through the darkness like a deadly shadow. For every story of human endurance I told, she whispered to her teammate David, the thin farmer, tonight we write a new one about human revenge. The raid lasted only 40 minutes, but those 40 minutes changed everything. Critical Valdorian equipment lay in smoking ruins. Their supply chain was broken. Their communications were damaged. Most importantly, their sense of complete control was shattered forever. When the attack ended, the humans disappeared back into their tunnels and caves as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the aliens staring at destruction they couldn't believe was possible. How could starving people fight with such deadly efficiency? As dawn broke over New Haven, Admiral Walsh appeared on all communication channels, broadcasting to both the Valdorian fleet and the watching galaxy. Though she looked like a walking skeleton, her voice carried the strength of unbreakable steel. "We are still here," she announced calmly. "We are still fighting. We are still human. And we have just proven that hungry humans are the most dangerous humans in the universe." Aboard the alien command ship, Subcommander Thexrill stared at the damage reports with something approaching fear. These humans had just demonstrated military capabilities that violated every principle of siege warfare his people understood. Starving soldiers weren't supposed to be able to plan complex operations. Desperate people weren't supposed to fight with such precision and coordination. "Sir," his communications officer reported with obvious nervousness, "we're receiving reports from across the galaxy. Other species are calling this the first successful counterattack against a Valdorian siege in over 50 years. The siege continued, but everything had changed. The humans had proven that being pushed to the edge of survival didn't make them weak. It made them absolutely lethal. The end came on a quiet Tuesday morning in the 8th week of the siege. The Valdorian ships simply lifted away from New Haven's orbit without warning or ceremony, disappearing into hyperspace as suddenly as they had arrived. No surrender had been accepted because none had been offered. No victory parade celebrated the aliens' departure because they left in shame rather than triumph. Subcommander Thexrill transmitted his final report to Valdorian High Command with hands that trembled from more than fatigue. The human colony of New Haven remains unconquered after 56 days of complete siege. Our standard tactics proved completely ineffective against a species capable of maintaining combat operations despite prolonged starvation. I strongly recommend immediate revision of all intelligence assessments regarding human military capabilities." He paused before adding the most difficult words of his military career. "These humans have demonstrated that biological limitations mean nothing when facing an enemy with unlimited determination. We withdrew not because of supply difficulties, but because continuing the siege served no strategic purpose. They will never surrender." Across the galaxy, the news traveled faster than the fleeing Valdorian ships. On hundreds of worlds, species that had submitted to alien conquest in hours or days watched their communication screens in stunned amazement. The impossible had happened. A technologically inferior species had defeated the galaxy's most successful military force through nothing more than stubborn refusal to quit. Admiral Catherine Walsh, now weighing 50 pounds less than at the siege's beginning, stood before the rebuilt communication array in New Haven's command center. Her uniform had been tailored 3 times to fit her smaller frame, but her voice carried the same unshakable strength that had sustained the colony through its darkest weeks. "People of the galaxy," she began, her image broadcast across thousands of worlds, "we did not seek this fight, but we could not avoid its lessons. Today you have seen proof that advanced weapons cannot defeat the human spirit. Superior numbers cannot overcome human determination. And no siege can break people who refuse to be broken." The response was immediate and revolutionary. On Kepler 442b, the Andromedan Resistance launched their first major operation against Valdorian occupation forces in 3 years. Using tactics inspired by the New Haven siege, they disappeared into their crystal cave networks and began a campaign of persistent harassment that would eventually drive the aliens from their world. On the water planet Aquatica, the Cetacean Council declared their neutrality agreements with the Valdorians null and void. If humans weighing barely half their normal body weight can defeat a siege fleet, announced their leader, perhaps we have been too quick to accept the inevitability of conquest. In the great halls of the Galactic Council, Ambassador Helen Wright returned to her position with newfound respect from colleagues who had previously considered humans a minor species. Her first speech after the siege's end would be studied in diplomatic academies for generations. Honored representatives, she said, the siege of New Haven was never about one small colony. It was about proving that surrender is a choice, not a requirement. It demonstrated that determination can overcome any technological advantage. Most importantly, it showed the galaxy that humans will endure any hardship rather than accept defeat. The Altarian ambassador, humanity's oldest ally, spoke with obvious admiration. We have observed many species face extinction rather than endure what your people survived voluntarily. Your demonstration of endurance has fundamentally altered how every civilization in this sector views both human capabilities and the nature of resistance itself. But the most significant changes occurred on worlds the humans would never visit. Throughout the galaxy, military academies began teaching new courses on asymmetric warfare and psychological endurance. The siege of New Haven became required study for officers in dozens of different species' armed forces. Dr. Thomas Harrison, restored to health but forever changed by the experience, published his medical findings in the Galactic Journal of Xenobiology. His paper, titled Human Endurance, A Study in Species Survival Capabilities, became the most downloaded research document in the journal's history. The human subjects maintained organized military effectiveness for 56 days while consuming less than 30% of their normal caloric intake, he wrote. This performance exceeds all previous models of biological limitation and suggests that psychological factors can override physical constraints in ways we are only beginning to understand. On Earth itself, recruitment for colonial defense forces increased by 400% in the months following the siege. Young people who had never considered military service suddenly wanted to prove they carried the same strength their cousins on New Haven had demonstrated. Margaret Collins returned to her library duties, but now she also served as New Haven's official historian. Her book about the siege, 56 Days, The Galaxy Learns About Human Stubbornness, became a bestseller on hundreds of worlds and was translated into over 2,000 languages. We didn't just defend one colony, she wrote in the book's conclusion. We defended the idea that free people don't have to accept conquest just because their enemies have bigger ships and better weapons. We proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the universe is the simple refusal to give up. Perhaps the most telling change came within the Valdorian Empire itself. Fleet commanders began receiving reports of increased resistance on previously conquered worlds. Species that had surrendered quickly now questioned their capitulation. The sight of skeletal humans continuing to fight had shattered the illusion that Valdorian conquest was inevitable. As Admiral Walsh looked up at the stars from New Haven's rebuilt command center, watching supply ships from Earth approach their orbit, she understood that they had won something far more valuable than a single battle. They had changed how the galaxy viewed humanity, but more importantly, they had reminded the universe that some things are worth starving for. The galaxy had learned to respect human determination, and nothing would ever be the same.